Hi, this is a video explaining a little bit the thinking behind the synchronous assessment. Number 2, launching a math lesson. So first of all, why is the math launch important? It sets up students for success in the lesson. For example, it lets them know what they will be learning, why they should be learning this, and how they will be learning this during the lesson. It's sort of like the hook to motivate learning. It's a culturally relevant teaching practice because we want teachers to connect the math they're doing to something that's relevant to the life of the students. It's a universal design for learning technique because it couches multiple perspectives and multiple ways of approaching a problem. And it should always support EL students by giving them an entry point to understanding the problem. So there were 5 considerations for the math launch that we asked the pathway teachers to consider. And we started that early on Wednesday of the first week of the course. And the first one is, why is this math concept I choose important for my students to learn? We wanted them to think about that before they just launched a lesson and to know an answer for that, and also put it in language that students might understand. Then we asked them, how will I provide a context that is relevant to my class of diverse learners? And that goes back to the culturally relevant teaching. How am I going to make this relevant to the lives of my students? How will I connect the new learning to prior learning for my students? And that's always an important part of anything we do in our classroom. Knowing what we did in the past connects what we're doing now and how we might move with it to the future. And then we were always looking at what math tools would be incorporated in my launch. So by math tools, we mean manipulative, so that you can move around, certainly, but also diagrams, charts, number lines, something that would support math learning in the lesson. And finally, how will my students participate in the launch? What we want is some aspect of student voice, student participation, either helping the teacher in the front of the room or partner talk or small group talk, but something that's not just the teacher talking and the students listening, but more interactive. And the rubric for this assessment is a little different than the other rubric for the assessment number 1, because there really wasn't like a bunch of criteria to put in this. So really it has, what we have here are the 5 considerations, and effectively is able to do that or not. And there were some examples. So it has to be open because every lesson would be different and every teacher would be a little different around that one. Importantly, it's not really linear. It's not that this has to happen before that, although there are some things that would be better placed in the front end of the launch, for example, relating to the context of students. But involving students in the launch obviously is a part of the whole 10 minutes. So it's not necessarily linear. There's just some things that might be more effective in the front end of the launch and some things that would be more effective at the back end of the launch. So one example is this problem we did from the 4th grade. It was called San Francisco Tour Group. And the way we started this lesson was asking students to think about, do you recognize anything in these photos? Have you been there before? Talk to a partner. Which one of these do you recognize? And then people would like raise their hand and say, I recognize Alcatraz because I went there with my family, or I recognize Chinatown because we took a school field trip there. So that's an example of like connecting to the lives of the students. And then we asked them to think about a chart that this problem has. So we asked them to think in partners, what do you notice about this chart? And that is another way of participating in the launch, having them think with partners about what the problem is about. And then we took responses and kind of discussed it and charted it in class. So before we work on this task, I said, let's review an anchor chart of multiplication strategies we have to solve problems when they are multi-digit multiplication, like two numbers by two number multiplication. Here's the box method that we did, and here's the partial product method we did. So the anchor chart in this launch would be like a tool, but specifically within the chart is the box method, which is definitely a tool, a way we solve math problems. And here's a partial product. It's another tool, an algorithm that we use to solve math problems. So this is an example of how we use tools. So then we read the problem out loud, had partners talk about it, and took any questions before they worked on this problem with partners. Something I did say in this launch also was that multiplying larger numbers together is a skill we use a lot in our life. It's related to what we've been doing since third grade when we did smaller numbers. And it'll relate to something we do in fifth grade when we start working with larger numbers, and particularly with decimals also. And it's just kind of a real life skill that we might very likely use when we're leading our lives in San Francisco, for example. So just kind of going back on that, the launch, why was this important? Because two-digit by two-digit multiplication is an important key concept that fourth graders learn. The context was relevant because it's about our city, San Francisco, and everyone could have had an entry point to understand something about that. Tried to connect it to previous learning in third grade and earlier in this unit, and also thinking about fifth grade. The tools were the anchor chart and specifically the algorithms in the anchor chart. So we didn't really want to use manipulatives for this lesson, but those were tools that we did want to focus on. And finally, we asked students either by relating to personal experience or talking to partners and a talking whole group about the problem. And that was the thinking around this assessment. Again, the math launch is super important. You can understand a lesson that's launched well will motivate students to lean into the math and really work and understand what they're supposed to do, versus math lessons that are launched sort of ambiguously and or poorly, or sort of procedurally that students may not feel motivated to do that. And that is why we chose this to be the assessment number 2 for the Pathways summer program.